My name is Grace Wilson, and at 78 years old, I finally found the strength to tell my story. Looking at me now, a grandmother with silver hair and hands spotted with age, you might see just another old woman with a collection of memories. But behind my eyes lies a tale so dark, so painful, that for years I couldn't speak it aloud, even to myself. I was born in the small town of Pinecrest, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where the mist clings to the peaks like old ghosts. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where church bells marked the passage of time, and where family secrets were buried deeper than the coal mines that provided most folks their livelihood. My childhood was simple, but happy. My mother taught me to bake bread, to sew, and to find beauty in the wildflowers that dotted our hillsides. My father worked the mines, coming home each day with coal dust embedded in the lines of his hands, lines that never quite washed clean. We didn't have much, but we had enough. We had love. When I was 17, I met Robert Wilson at a church picnic. He had kind eyes, strong hands, and a laugh that seemed to echo through the mountain valleys. We were married a year later in the white wooden church, where our families had worshipped for generations. I still remember the sunlight filtering through those stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns on my simple white dress. I thought that day marked the beginning of my happily ever after. For a while, it was. We built a life together in a small cabin at the edge of town. Robert worked the mines like my father before him, and I kept our home. We had two beautiful boys, Thomas, born in the harsh winter of 1943, and William, who arrived just 14 months later during a spring thunderstorm. They were my pride, my joy, my entire world. I would watch them play in the yard, their laughter carrying on the mountain breeze, and think that God had blessed me beyond measure. I never realized that sometimes the things we love most can become the very chains that bind us, that the hands that once reached for mine in innocent need could one day close around my life like a vice. A family's love should be a shelter, not a prison. But I learned too late that sometimes the two are separated by nothing more than a whisper, a moment, a single tragic turn of fate. The day everything changed was ordinary in every way, until it wasn't. It was fall, and the mountains were ablaze with color, fiery reds, burning oranges and golds, so bright they hurt your eyes. Robert had gone to work like any other day, kissing me goodbye at the door, ruffling the boy's hair, and promising to bring home trout for dinner if he had time to fish after his shift. I was hanging laundry when I heard the truck coming up our dirt road. Even before I saw Sheriff Davis's grim face, I knew. A woman in a mining town develops a sixth sense about these things. The way the air shifts, the way time seems to slow down and stretch like taffy. I knew Robert wasn't coming home. There had been a collapse. 6 men lost, Robert among them. The days after were a blur of black clothing, casseroles I couldn't eat, and the hollow platitudes of well-meaning neighbors. "He's with the Lord now," they'd say. "At least it was quick. You're young yet, Grace. You've got those boys to think about." Thomas was 12 then, William just 11. They stood beside me at the funeral, two solemn-faced boys in borrowed suits that didn't quite fit, watching as we lowered their father into the ground. I was 32 years old, a widow with 2 growing boys and a future suddenly as uncertain as the shifting earth that had claimed my husband. That night, as I sat on our porch swing, watching the stars emerge one by one, Thomas came and sat beside me. He took my hand in his no longer a child's hand, but not yet a man's either, and said words that would echo through the years to come. "Don't worry, Mama," he said, his voice cracking with the effort of sounding grown. "Me and we'll take care of you now." I smiled through my tears and kissed his forehead, grateful for his sweet heart. How could I have known that those innocent words contained the seeds of my future imprisonment, that the love of my sons would become twisted into something I wouldn't recognize until it was too late? If I had seen the strange light in Thomas's eyes that night, the possessive way his hand tightened on mine, perhaps I might have steered our family ship away from the rocks that waited in the darkness ahead. But grief had blinded me, and all I could see was a boy trying desperately to be the man his father would have wanted him to be. The changes were gradual, like water wearing away stone, so subtle that by the time I noticed, the damage was already done. It started with small things. Thomas and William took over more and more responsibilities. They chopped wood, patched the leaky roof, and when they were old enough, found work at the local sawmill. I was proud of them, these sons of mine who had grown so capable in the wake of their father's death. But with their increased contribution came an increased sense of ownership, of me, of our home, of our lives. "You don't need to mend for the Johnsons anymore, Mama," Thomas would say, pressing bills into my hand. "We make enough now." "The storm looks bad," William would insist. "Better not go into town today." I yielded to their concerns, touched by their protectiveness. After years of being the strong one, there was comfort in being cared for. And in my grief, which never quite seemed to fade, I allowed myself to be wrapped in the cocoon they built around me. By the time Thomas was 20 and William 19, they had constructed an invisible fence around our lives. I rarely went into town anymore. Friends who came to visit were met with cold stares and monosyllabic answers, until their visits became less and less frequent. Even the pastor's wife, Sarah, who had been my friend since childhood, eventually stopped trying. Our small cabin, once a place of warmth and light, began to feel different. The walls seemed to close in a little more each day. The windows, always clear and bright in Robert's time, now often remained shuttered, keeping the world at bay. I didn't see it then, how could I? The cage was built so slowly, so carefully, that by the time I noticed the bars, I was already locked inside. My son's love had become a chain, and I had helped forge every link. One evening, as I watched the sunset paint the mountains in fading gold, I suddenly realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd walked into town alone. Couldn't recall when I'd last spoken to anyone besides Thomas and William. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. I looked at my hands, once young and strong, now showing the first signs of age, and wondered, when did I surrender my life to my children? When did their protection become my prison? That night, as the moon cast long shadows through our cabin windows, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Rebellion. The seed of resistance, planted in that moment of clarity, would take time to grow, but grow it would, watered by the slow realization that the life I was living was no longer my own. Little did I know that the real darkness had not yet begun, that the controlling behavior I was finally recognizing was merely the prelude to a nightmare I couldn't yet imagine. My children's eyes had changed, and if I had looked closely enough, I might have seen the thing lurking behind their gaze, the hunger, the possession, the twisted sense of entitlement that would soon consume us all. The walls of my world continued to shrink. Thomas and William worked at the sawmill during the day, returning home with sawdust in their hair and a watchfulness in their eyes that made me uneasy. They built a routine around me, creating a clockwork life where everything was controlled, measured, anticipated. One spring morning, I decided to walk to the miller's farm a mile down the road. Their daughter had just had a baby, and I wanted to bring her some of my blackberry preserves. I didn't tell the boys they would be at work for hours yet, and I'd be back long before they returned. The freedom of that walk was intoxicating. The dirt road beneath my feet, the wild rhododendrons blooming pink along the ditches, the bird song filling the air. It was like drinking cool water after a long thirst. I hadn't realized how much I missed the simple pleasure of walking alone under an open sky. Eliza Miller was delighted to see me. She brewed tea, showed me her new granddaughter, and we talked for hours like we used to, catching up on all the town gossip I'd missed. It felt like stepping back into my old self, the Grace who had friends and opinions and a place in the community. I lost track of time. When I finally noticed the sun's position, I gasped and made my excuses. I hurried home, my heart racing with a strange mixture of lingering joy and growing dread. I was still a quarter mile from our cabin when I heard them calling my name. Thomas and William were in the road, their faces twisted with anger and fear. When they saw me, Thomas ran forward and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh. "Where were you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "We came home and you were gone." "You could have been hurt," William added, his face pale. "Anything could have happened." They marched me home between them, a prisoner returning to her cell. Inside the cabin, the interrogation continued. Where had I been? Who had I spoken to? What had I told them? "I just went to see Eliza," I said, bewildered by their reaction. "Her daughter had a baby." "You should have told us," Thomas said, pacing the floor like a caged animal. "We would have taken you on Sunday." "I don't need permission to visit a friend," I replied, a spark of defiance flaring inside me. The look that passed between my sons sent a chill down my spine. It was calculating, cold, and somehow synchronized, as if they shared a single mind. "It's not safe for you to wander around alone, Mama," William said softly. "What if you fell? What if you got hurt? No one would know where to find you." "I'm 40 years old, not 80, I countered. "I'm perfectly capable of walking a mile down a road I've known all my life." Thomas knelt before me, taking my hands in his. His face softened, but his eyes remained hard. "We just worry about you, Mama. We couldn't bear it if something happened to you. Not after Dad." And there it was, the invocation of their father, the emotional lever they knew would move me. I felt myself weakening, the brief rebellion fading in the face of their concern. What kind of mother was I, to cause them such distress? "I'm sorry," I whispered, hating myself for the surrender. "I should have left a note." That night, as I lay in bed, listening to my sons moving about the cabin, securing doors and windows against imagined threats, I finally recognized the trap I was in. This wasn't protection. This was possession. And for the first time, I felt truly afraid, not of the outside world my sons claimed to be protecting me from, but of the two men sleeping under my roof. I turned my face into my pillow and wept silently, mourning the sweet boys they had once been, and fearing the men they had become. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the hollow ache in my chest. I was a prisoner in my own home, and the most terrifying part was that I had no idea how to escape. A woman alone can become many things, but until that moment, I never thought she could become a captive to the very lives she brought into the world. The love I had nurtured had grown into something unrecognizable, something that cast long shadows across my days and left me trembling in the darkness of my nights. After my unauthorized trip to the Millers, things got worse. Thomas installed a new bolt on the front door, one that required a key which he kept on a chain around his neck. William began staying home from work some days, claiming he was feeling unwell. But I knew he was there to watch me. I became a ghost in my own home, moving silently from room to room, cooking their meals, washing their clothes, but never quite meeting their eyes. I was afraid of what I might see there, and even more afraid of what they might see in mine. My growing anger, my dawning understanding, my fear. One afternoon, while William was dozing in the front room and Thomas was at the mill, I slipped into the boys' bedroom. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just searching for something. Evidence, perhaps, some explanation for what was happening to us. Their room was neat, another change that had come over them. My once messy boys now kept their space ordered with almost military precision. I ran my fingers over their shirts, folded in perfect squares, touched the matching hunting knives they kept on the dresser. Then I noticed Thomas's journal, hidden beneath his pillow. I hesitated only a moment before opening it. A mother should respect her children's privacy. But these were no longer children, and I was no longer just their mother. I was their prisoner, and I needed to understand my captors. The journal was filled with Thomas's neat, blocky handwriting. Most entries were mundane, notes about work, complaints about the foreman, observations about the weather. But then, I found entries about me. Mama tried to talk to the pastor's wife after church again. Had to cut that short. She doesn't understand that people use her kindness against her. Caught Mama looking out the window for too long today. She's restless. Need to keep her busier. Will and I agree. We can't risk losing her like we lost Dad. The world is too dangerous. She's safer with us. We're the only ones who truly love her. A chill ran through me as I read. This wasn't the ranting of a madman. It was worse. It was the careful, methodical thinking of someone who truly believed he was right, who believed that what he was doing was born of love. I heard Williams stirring in the other room and quickly replaced the journal, my heart pounding. I slipped back to the kitchen just as he appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What are you doing, Mama?" he asked, his voice thick with suspicion. "Just starting supper," I replied, turning to the stove to hide my face. My hands were shaking. That night, as my sons sat at the table eating the stew I'd made, I studied them from beneath lowered lashes. Thomas, with his father's strong jaw and broad shoulders. William, leaner, but with the same intense blue eyes. My boys, my jailers. How had we come to this? How had the tragedy of losing Robert warped them so completely? Or had the seeds of this possessiveness always been there, merely waiting for the right conditions to grow? I thought of Robert then, of his easy laugh and gentle touch. What would he think of what his sons had become? What would he tell me to do? And in that moment, as if hearing his voice carried on the evening breeze that drifted through the window, I knew Robert would tell me to fight, to run, to save, not only myself, but also our sons from what they were becoming. I straightened my shoulders slightly, feeling something long dormant awakening within me. Courage, perhaps, or simply the will to live as more than a shadow. I didn't know it then, but that small internal shift, that tiny rebellion of spirit, would be the first step on a long, dangerous path to freedom. A path that would test every ounce of strength I had left and reveal reserves I never knew I possessed. A woman's heart is a deep ocean of secrets, they say, and mine was beginning to churn with tides of resistance that would eventually become a storm. The opportunity came on a Sunday morning. Thomas and William always took me to church, their one concession to normalcy, perhaps because refusing would have raised too many questions. They flanked me in the pew like guards, nodding politely to neighbors but discouraging any extended conversation. On this particular Sunday, Pastor Mitchell preached about the prodigal son, about forgiveness and redemption, about how God's love frees us rather than constrains us. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, the irony of his words not lost on me. After the service, as we filed out into the churchyard, Martha Evans approached us. She had been my close friend once, before my life contracted to the four walls of our cabin. Her eyes were kind but concerned as she looked at me. "Grace," she said warmly, "it's been too long since we've had a proper visit. Why don't you come for tea this week? Tuesday, perhaps?" Before I could answer, Thomas's arms slid around my shoulders. "Mama's been feeling poorly lately," he said smoothly. "Maybe another time." Martha's gaze flickered to his hand on my shoulder, then back to my face. Something in my expression must have alarmed her, because her eyes widened slightly. "Well," she said carefully, "the offer stands whenever you're feeling better, Grace." As she walked away, I felt Thomas's fingers tighten, almost imperceptibly on my shoulder. A warning. That afternoon, as we walked home along the dirt road that wound through the forest, I found myself a few steps behind my sons. They were discussing something about work, their heads bent together. For the first time in months, I wasn't directly under their gaze. I looked at the woods around us, at the familiar paths I'd known since childhood, paths that led to other farms, to the creek where I'd played as a girl, to places beyond my son's control. For one wild, heart-stopping moment, I considered running, just turning and fleeing into the trees, like a deer before hunters. But where would I go? Who would believe me? And even if I escaped, how long before my sons found me? No, running blindly wouldn't work. I needed a plan. I needed help. Martha's concerned face flashed in my mind. Perhaps she had seen something in our brief interaction. Perhaps she could be an ally. That night, as my son slept, I crept to the kitchen and found a scrap of paper and a pencil stub. By the faint moonlight coming through the window, I wrote a simple message. Martha, I need help. Not safe. Please tell Sheriff Davis. Grace. I folded the paper into a tiny square and hid it in the secret pocket I'd sewn into my church dress. Next Sunday, I promised myself. Next Sunday, I would find a way to get the note to Martha. For the first time in years, I fell asleep with something new warming my chest. Hope. The week crawled by with agonizing slowness. I was careful to act normally, to give my sons no reason for suspicion. I cooked their favorite meals, listened to their stories from work, and kept my eyes appropriately downcast. All the while, the note burned in my pocket like a coal, and plans formed and reformed in my mind. Sunday dawned bright and clear. I dressed carefully, making sure my note was secure in its hiding place. At breakfast, I noticed William watching me with narrowed eyes. You seem different today, Mama, he said, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. Excited about something, I forced a small smile. Just looking forward to Pastor Mitchell's sermon. He mentioned last week he'd be talking about the Psalms today. You know how I love the Psalms. William nodded slowly, but the suspicion didn't leave his eyes. I felt a flutter of panic. Had he noticed something? A change in my demeanor, perhaps? I needed to be more careful. At church, I sat between my sons as usual, my hands clutched tightly in my lap to stop their trembling. Martha was 3 pews ahead, her gray head bowed in prayer. I needed to get to her, just for a moment, just long enough to pass the note. When the service ended, Thomas immediately stood, his hand extended to help me up. Ready to go, Mama? Looks like rain coming. The sky outside was clear blue. His excuse was as transparent as the desperation I felt rising in my throat. I thought I might speak to Pastor Mitchell for a moment, I said, my voice miraculously steady. About that passage from Psalms? Thomas and William exchanged a glance. We'll come with you, William said. And so, they did, hovering at my elbows as I made stilted conversation with the pastor. Martha was shaking hands with Mrs. Cooper near the door. She would be gone in moments, and with her my chance. I need to use the ladies' room, I blurted suddenly, interrupting Pastor Mitchell mid-sentence. Thomas frowned. Can't it wait until we get home? I'm afraid not, I said, infusing my voice with embarrassment. It's women's troubles. It was a calculated risk. My sons, for all their controlling behavior, were still men raised in a time when women's bodies were a mystery best left undiscussed. Thomas's cheeks colored slightly, and he nodded. We'll wait right here, William said firmly. I hurried toward the church's small bathroom, my heart pounding. Martha was still by the door. If I could just... I deliberately stumbled as I passed her, grabbing her arm for balance. In that moment of contact, I pressed the folded note into her palm. Oh, I'm so sorry, I gasped loudly. For the benefit of my watching sons. Martha's fingers closed around the note, her eyes meeting mine in a flash of understanding. No harm done, Grace, she said evenly, but I could see the alarm in her eyes. I continued to the bathroom, my legs weak with adrenaline. I had done it. The message was delivered. Now all I could do was wait and pray that Martha would understand, that she would help, that salvation was finally on its way. What I didn't know then was that my small act of rebellion had not gone unnoticed. And the storm that was about to break over our cabin would change everything forever. 3 days passed with no word, no sign that Martha had received my message or taken any action. I began to despair. Had she dismissed my note as foolishness? Had she been too afraid to get involved? Or worse, had she gone to my sons first, thinking they should know their mother was making wild claims? On the 4th day, Thomas came home from work early, his face like thunder, He strode into the kitchen where I was peeling potatoes and slammed his lunch pail down on the table. "Sheriff Davis came to the mill today," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Asking questions about you." The potato peeler slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, clattering into the sink. What kind of questions?" I managed to ask. "He wanted to know if you were well. Said someone in town was concerned that they hadn't seen you around much." Thomas's eyes bored into mine. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, Mama?" I shook my head, unable to speak past the fear closing my throat. Thomas watched me for a long moment, then turned away. "I told him you were just fine. That you prefer staying home these days. That you have everything you need right here with your family." He paused at the doorway. I'm sure he believed me. After all, what reason would he have not to? After he left the room, I gripped the edge of the sink, my legs threatening to give way. The sheriff had come, Martha had understood. Help was trying to reach me, but my sons were on alert now, and the path to freedom had just become much more dangerous. That night, things changed again. Thomas brought home a padlock for my bedroom door, ostensibly to keep me safe while they were at work. William installed bars on my window, explaining with a cold smile that there had been reports of bears in the area. I was no longer merely controlled. I was a prisoner in truth now. 2 more weeks passed in this new, harsher reality. My sons took turns staying home from work to watch me. The only time I was alone was when I was locked in my room. And even then, I suspected they checked on me through the keyhole. I began to lose hope. The walls seemed to inch closer each day. The air felt thinner. Sometimes I would press my face to the barred window of my room, breathing in the scent of pine and earth, wondering if I would ever walk freely among the trees again. Then came the night that changed everything. I was in my room, the lock turned from the outside as usual. The house was quiet. My sons had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day at the mill. I sat by my window, gazing at the sliver of moon visible between the bars, when I heard it, a soft tapping at the glass. I nearly cried out in shock. There, balanced precariously on a ladder outside my second-story window, was Martha Evans. She pressed a finger to her lips, then pointed to something she was sliding between the bars, a small metal file. I took it with trembling hands, understanding immediately. The bars were new, hastily installed. The metal was soft. I could cut through them if I had time. Martha pointed to her watch, then held up 2 fingers. 2 nights? 2 hours? I wasn't sure, but I nodded vigorously. She gave me a thumbs up, then carefully descended the ladder and disappeared into the darkness. I clutched the file to my chest, my mind racing. This was it, my chance for escape. But I would need to be careful, patient, precise. For the next 2 nights, whenever I was locked in my room, I worked on the bars. It was painstaking, exhausting work. I had to file slowly to minimize noise, stopping at the slightest sound from elsewhere in the house. My hands became raw and blistered, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. On the 3rd night, the final bar gave way. I had created an opening just large enough for a person to slip through. For me to slip. I waited until the house had been silent for hours, until I was certain my sons were deep in sleep. Then I gathered the few things I had managed to secretly prepare. A change of clothes, the small amount of money I'd hidden away over the years, a locket with Robert's picture, and a shawl for warmth. The night was moonless, perfect for my escape. I removed the loosened bars as quietly as possible, wincing at each small scrape of metal. Then I squeezed through the opening, lowering myself carefully until I was hanging by my fingertips from the window ledge. It was a long drop to the ground below. I closed my eyes, said a silent prayer, and let go. The impact drove the breath from my lungs, but nothing felt broken. I lay still for a moment, listening for any sound from inside the cabin. Nothing. I had made it this far undetected. Gathering my meager belongings, I rose unsteadily to my feet and began moving away from the cabin, staying in the shadows of the trees. I had no clear plan beyond reaching Martha's house, over 2 miles away. She would help me. She had to. I had gone perhaps half a mile when I heard it. A shout from behind me. My name, carried on the night air in a voice twisted with rage and disbelief. Thomas had discovered my empty room. Panic gave me speed I didn't know I still possessed. I ran blindly through the familiar woods, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Behind me, I could hear my sons crashing through the underbrush, calling my name with increasing desperation. "Mama, stop! Come back! You don't know what you're doing, Mama! It's not safe." Their voices grew closer. They knew these woods as well as I did, and they were younger, stronger, faster. The realization hit me with sickening clarity. I wasn't going to make it to Martha's. They would catch me, and then, what? What would they do to ensure I never tried to escape again? The sound of rushing water reached my ears. The creek swollen with spring rain, too deep and fast to cross safely in daylight, let alone in the dead of night. But it was my only chance. I burst from the tree line onto the creek bank, my son's footsteps thundering behind me. Without hesitation, I plunged into the icy water. The current immediately seized me, pulling me downstream. I gasped at the cold, struggling to keep my head above water as the creek carried me away from my pursuers. "Mama!" Thomas's anguished cry faded behind me as the water swept me around a bend. I don't know how long I was in that creek fighting for breath, for life itself, minutes that felt like hours. The cold numbed my body, but a fierce determination kept me moving, kept me from surrendering to the current. When my feet finally touched bottom in a shallow stretch, I dragged myself onto the bank, soaked and shivering but alive. And free. I lay there for a time too exhausted to move, listening for any sound of pursuit. But there was only the gurgle of the creek and the whisper of wind in the pines. Eventually, I forced myself to my feet. I was disoriented, unsure of exactly where the creek had deposited me, but I knew I needed to keep moving. Dawn would come soon, and with it, a more organized search. I chose a direction and began walking, each step carrying me further from the prison my home had become. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and hardship, but also possibility, choice, freedom. As the first faint light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, I allowed myself to believe that I might actually escape, that this nightmare might finally end. What I couldn't know, was that the final confrontation was still to come, that before this day ended, blood would be spilled and lives would be forever altered, including mine. I walked for hours as the sun climbed higher in the sky. My clothes had dried somewhat, but still clung uncomfortably to my skin. My shoes squelched with each step. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but fear drove me onward. I wasn't on any path now, just moving steadily downhill, hoping to eventually reach a road or a farm, somewhere I could find help. The wilderness had always been my son's domain. They were the hunters, the trackers. I was just a woman who hadn't ventured more than a mile from her cabin in years. By midday, exhaustion began to claim me. My steps faltered, my vision blurred. I needed rest, but rest meant stopping, and stopping meant risking capture. Then, through the trees ahead, I saw it, a small hunter's cabin, weathered and gray, smoke curling from its chimney. Someone was there, someone who might help me. I approached cautiously, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. When I reached the clearing around the cabin, the door opened, and an old man stepped out, a shotgun cradled in his arms. "That's far enough," he called, raising the gun slightly. "State your business." I raised my hands to show I was unarmed. "Please," I said, my voice cracking from thirst and fear. "I need help. My name is Grace Wilson. I'm running from my sons." The old man's bushy eyebrows rose. "Wilson? From up near Pinecrest?" I nodded, hope flaring in my chest. "Yes. Do you know me?" "Know of you," he said, lowering his gun slightly. Heard tell of a widow up that way, keeps to herself, or gets kept to herself. If what I hear is true, relief made my knees weak. Then you'll help me? I need to get to town, to the sheriff. My sons. They've kept me prisoner for years. I just escaped last night. The old man studied me for a long moment, then jerked his head toward the cabin. Come on in then. You look half drowned and fully spent. I've got coffee on. His name was Jeremiah Tanner. He told me as he poured me a mug of strong black coffee. He was a trapper, living on the mountain most of the year, coming to town only to sell his furs and buy supplies. Not much for people, he said, pushing a plate of cornbread toward me. But I do hear things when I'm in town. Heard about those boys of yours. How they keep you tucked away like some precious thing that might break. He eyed me over his own mug. Never thought it was right, but folks around here tend to mind their own business. It's worse than they know, I said quietly, warming my hands on the mug. Much worse. I told him everything. The years of increasing control, the isolation, the fear, how they had turned from protective sons to possessive jailers. I told him about Martha's help, my escape through the barred window, the desperate flight through the woods. Jeremiah listened without interruption, his weathered face growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he stood abruptly, reaching for his shotgun. Well then, he said grimly, we'd best get you to town and the sheriff. Your boys will be searching, and this cabin ain't exactly hard to find if they come this way. He gave me his spare coat, enormous on my frame, but warm, and a hat to cover my distinctive silver hair. We set out immediately, Jeremiah leading me along game trails I would never have found on my own. Quicker this way, he explained. Road's too obvious, they'll be watching it. We had been walking for perhaps an hour when Jeremiah suddenly froze, holding up a hand for silence. I stopped, my heart pounding. At first, I heard nothing beyond the usual forest sounds. Then it came. Voices, male voices, coming closer. Tracks lead this way. She can't have gone far, not in her condition. Thomas. He was tracking me like an animal. Jeremiah motioned me behind a large boulder, then positioned himself beside me, shotgun ready. Still a mile to town, he whispered. Too far to run. We'll have to stand our ground if they find us. The voices grew louder. I could distinguish William's higher pitch now, arguing with his brother. This is pointless, Thomas. She's probably reached town already. We should just go home, pretend everything's normal when they come asking. And what? Let her tell lies about us? Let them take her away? She's our mother, Will? She belongs with us? She doesn't want to be with us anymore. Did you see her face when she ran? She's afraid of us, Thomas. We've become the thing she fears most. There was a scuffling sound, then a thud, and I heard William's voice clearly now, fraught with regret. What are we doing, Thomas? We've kept our own mother locked up for years. We're not protecting her anymore. We're hurting her. Shut up, Thomas hissed. She doesn't know what's best for her. She never has. The world will destroy her if we let her go. Jeremiah's grip tightened on his shotgun. My breath caught in my throat as footsteps approached our hiding place. Look, William said suddenly. Footprints. 2 sets. She's with someone, Thomas growled. Someone who took her from us. The boulder no longer felt like adequate protection. They were too close, would find us any moment. Jeremiah seemed to reach the same conclusion. He stood, stepping out from behind the rock with his shotgun raised. That's far enough, boys, he said, his voice steady and hard as iron. I rose shakily to stand beside him. Thomas and William stood frozen on the path, their faces registering shock, then fury as they saw me. Mama, Thomas said, taking a step forward. Come home, now. Jeremiah cocked his shotgun. The lady ain't going anywhere with you. We're heading to town to see Sheriff Davis. William's eyes darted between me and the gun. Mama, he pleaded, who is this man? What has he told you? We're your sons. We love you. Love? I found my voice at last, stronger than I expected. You call what you've done to me love. You've kept me prisoner for years. You've stolen my life. We protected you. Thomas shouted. Everything we did was to keep you safe. Safe? I laughed, a bitter sound even to my own ears. I wasn't safe. I was buried alive. Thomas's face darkened. He took another step forward, ignoring Jeremiah's warning gesture with the gun. You're confused, Mama. You're not thinking clearly. Come home with us, and everything will be fine. We forgive you for running. You forgive me? The audacity of it struck me like a physical blow. I'm not the one who needs forgiveness, Thomas. For a moment, something like doubt flickered across his face. Then it hardened into resolve. I'm not leaving without you, he said quietly. Yes, I replied, just as quietly. You are. What happened next unfolded in heartbeats. Thomas lunged forward. Jeremiah raised his shotgun. William shouted a warning. The forest exploded with the sound of the gun firing. Thomas stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder where the shotgun blast had caught him. Blood seeped between his fingers as he stared at me with disbelief and betrayal. Mama, he whispered. William rushed to his brother's side, pressing his hand over the wound. His eyes, when they met mine, were filled not with anger but with a terrible understanding. Go, he said simply. Go before he bleeds out and I change my mind. Jeremiah grabbed my arm, pulling me away. Come on, he urged. Town's not far. As we hurried down the path, I looked back once. My son stood in a shaft of sunlight breaking through the trees. William supporting Thomas, both watching me leave. They looked small, suddenly. Diminished. Just two lost men standing in the forest, watching their world crumble around them. I turned away and didn't look back again. Each step carried me further from them. From the cabin, from the prison my life had become. Each step was heavier than the last, weighted with grief and loss, and a strange, terrible freedom. By the time we reached the outskirts of town, I was weeping openly, though whether for my sons, for myself, or for the years we had all lost to fear and obsession, I couldn't have said. Sheriff Davis found us as we approached the main street. Word of my escape had already reached town, it seemed. Martha had made sure of that. Mrs. Wilson, he said, helping me into his car. You're safe now. It's over. But it wasn't over. Not really. It was just beginning, the long, painful process of reclaiming a life that had been stolen from me, of learning who Grace Wilson was after years of being nothing more than an object of possession. The days that followed were a blur of statements and questions. I told my story, not all of it, but enough. Enough for arrest warrants to be issued for my sons. Enough for the town to understand, at least partially, what had happened in that cabin in the woods. Thomas's wound wasn't fatal. Both he and William were arrested, charged with unlawful imprisonment, assault, and a host of other crimes I couldn't bear to hear named. I didn't attend their trial, couldn't face them across a courtroom, couldn't listen to the details of my captivity laid bare for public consumption. They were sentenced to 15 years each, a lifetime, it seemed to me, though the prosecutor had pushed for more. I stayed with Martha at first, then found a small apartment in town. People were kind, if somewhat distant. The story had shocked everyone, left them uncertain how to behave around me. I was an oddity, a curiosity, the woman who had been kept prisoner by her own sons. I felt their stares in the grocery store, heard their whispers in church. But slowly, life settled into a new rhythm. I found work at the local library, shelving books and helping children find stories of adventure and magic. I made friends, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. I learned to drive, bought a used car, took evening classes at the community college in the next town over, and gradually, I remembered who I was. Who I had been before grief and fear had twisted my family into something unrecognizable. I was Grace Wilson, not just a mother, not just a victim, but a woman with her own dreams, her own desires, her own voice. 5 years after my escape, I met James Thornton, at a community dance. He was a widower, a kind man with laugh lines around his eyes and no expectations beyond companionship. We married a year later in a small ceremony by the lake. His 3 grown children welcomed me warmly, and in time I found myself surrounded by a new family. Stepchildren, step-grandchildren, a life full of birthday parties and Sunday dinners and ordinary, precious freedom. I never returned to the cabin in the woods. James offered to go with me once, thinking it might bring closure, but I declined. That place belonged to a different lifetime, one I had fought too hard to escape. My sons wrote to me from prison, letters filled with apologies, with explanations, with pleas for forgiveness. At first, I couldn't bring myself to read them. Later, I did, but couldn't respond. The wounds were too deep, the betrayal too profound. It was William who eventually broke through. His letters were different from Thomas's, more reflective, less demanding. He wrote not to ask for forgiveness, but to offer understanding. "I see now what we did to you," he wrote in one letter. "How we twisted love into something ugly and wrong. I don't expect you to forgive us, Mama. I just want you to know that I understand now. And I'm sorry. So deeply sorry." After 7 years, I visited him, just once. He was thinner, older, his eyes holding a wisdom born of hard reflection. We talked for an hour about nothing important. The weather, the books he was reading, the classes he was taking. As I rose to leave, he asked the question I knew had been on his lips the whole time. "Are you happy, Mama?" I considered my answer carefully. "Yes," I said finally. "I'm free, and I'm learning what that means. I think that's happiness." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." I never saw Thomas again. He died in prison of pneumonia 3 years before their sentences were up. I mourned him, but from a distance, as one mourns a stranger who once meant everything. William was released after serving 12 years. He moved to Arizona, married a woman he met through a prison pen pal program, and became a counselor for troubled youth. We exchanged Christmas cards. Nothing more. Now at 78, looking back on the long, strange journey of my life, I find myself thinking not of the years of captivity, but of that moment by the creek, when I chose to plunge into the dangerous waters rather than return to my prison. It was the moment I reclaimed my power, my agency, my very self. I've learned that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are built by those who claim to love us most. That sometimes the hardest chains to break are those forged in the name of protection and care. But I've also learned that it's never too late to begin again. That even after decades of darkness, light can find its way in. That freedom once tasted is worth any risk, any pain, any loss. My name is Grace Wilson Thornton. I am a survivor, a grandmother, a woman who walked through fire and emerged, transformed. And if my story can help even one person find the courage to break their own chains, then perhaps those lost years weren't entirely in vain. Because here's what I know for certain: a life without freedom is no life at all. And even the smallest bird, once freed from its cage, will find that it remembers how to fly.